Hi everybody, welcome to the Bee Museum Life Science Live. Thank you as always for joining us. We'll give it just a second to let some people hop on. But today we're going to have a really fun time. We're going to be learning a little bit about reptiles. So reptiles are a class of animals that include animals like snakes and lizards and turtles and crocodiles and those kinds of things. So we'll be talking about what some of the similarities between reptiles are, because those animals that I listed, snakes and lizards and turtles and crocodiles, those all look very different. And they all have some very different attributes, but they have some important similarities that put them in the same class of animals. So the first similarity that we're going to talk about between reptiles is that all reptiles have a backbone. And so if you take your hand and you put it on your back, you might feel some bumps on your back. And that's our backbone. So we also have a backbone just like all reptiles do. So the first specimen that I'm going to show you guys is right here. This is a really big one. Let me scoot back a little bit so you can see it maybe a little bit better. So this right here is a large sea turtle shell. You see how big it is? This is a really big reptile. Imagine the turtle that was underneath this shell. So it's a common misconception that turtles can come out of their shells, but that is actually not true. Turtles are born with their shells, and they keep their shells with them their whole life. And that's because their shells are crucial to their bone structure. And so if you look on the underside, this is the underside of the sea turtle shell. You'll see that you can see its backbone here. Its backbone is put right into its shell. So even though a turtle shell might look like maybe the turtle can go in and out of it, it actually can't. The shell is part of its backbone, and we can't go in and out of our backbones, right? We're stuck with it our entire lives. So that is the turtle shell with the backbone in it. So all turtles, even though they don't necessarily look like it, also have a backbone just like we do. All right. Another kind of reptile that is also sometimes mistaken to not have a backbone is a snake. And that's because snakes are super, super wiggly, right? Our backbones help give us structure, and they help us stand tall, and they help keep us straight. But snakes don't stay straight very often. They have to wiggle to be able to move. So it seems like they might not have a backbone, right? Here I have this snake here. This is a cobra, and you'll see at the very bottom he's kind of twisted around. And so he's really wiggly, and he's able to twist and to move a lot. And so because of that, people sometimes think that they don't have a backbone. But they do. The way that they're able to be so move and so wiggly is that they have a lot more vertebrae than we do. So as humans, we have 33 vertebrae and 24 ribs. But snakes can have anywhere between 200 and 300 vertebrae. So that's how they're able to be so wiggly, is they have a lot more points in their backbone that they're able to move and that they're able to wiggle. So that's how snakes are able to move and to be so wiggly, but still have a backbone at the same time. Unfortunately, we don't have that many vertebrae, else we'd be able to be super wiggly just like snakes. But we have legs that we're able to walk with, and snakes don't have that, so they have to rely on their ability to slither across the ground. All right, so all reptiles have a backbone, even the ones that don't look like it, like the snakes and the turtles. Another thing that all reptiles have that's similar is they all have either scales or another similar structure called a scute. So we're going to talk about what scales and scutes are, what the difference is, and why reptiles have them. So first of all, we will talk about scales. So this right here is a green iguana, and you can see he has lots of different kinds of scales on him. A lot of them have different structures and different purposes. Scales are formed in the epidermis of an animal, or of a reptile. The epidermis is the top layer of skin. Now there's another class of animal that also has scales, and that's the fish. And fish scales come from the lower level of skin called the dermis. So those are two really big words, and they're pretty similar. So epidermis is on top and dermis is on the bottom. And reptile scales come from the epidermis. Theirs is the top layer. If you've ever eaten a fish or caught a fish, you can remove the scales from the fish and it is kind of a skin underneath. But you can't do that with reptiles. That's because their scales come from the top layer. And that seems like kind of a small distinction to make, kind of a small difference. But in science, those small differences make all the difference, and that's how we're able to classify animals into different families and different classes and stuff. So for reptiles, the scales come from the epidermis, or the very top layer of the skin. And these scales are made out of keratin. And keratin is the same material that our fingernails and our hair is made out of. So that is the difference. And one reason that reptiles will have these scales is it helps to protect them, because keratin is a lot harder than our skin is, and so it acts as a little bit of a shield for the reptiles. And it also helps with water retention. Reptile scales overlap. You can kind of see that here. Reptile scales overlap, and that helps the water not to evaporate off their skin as quickly. So we talked about how the reptile scales come from the top layer of skin and how they're made out of keratin. And keratin is not a living thing. Our hair isn't alive. We can touch it, and we can't feel that touch on our hair because our hair isn't alive. And so because the keratin isn't a living thing, when it gets damaged or if it gets parasites or bugs on it, the scales aren't able to repair themselves. So to combat that, some species of reptiles will shed their scales, or they'll shed their skins. And one super common example of that is snakes. Snakes will shed their skins so that they can grow new ones, so they can grow new scales that are fresh and clean, and it helps to repair the damage. They just get rid of the ones that are damaged and they grow new ones so that they can be able to continue to move and to live. So here I have a little piece of snake skin that was shed from a snake. You can still see that pattern on there. This is super flimsy though. It's just the very top layer that's shed. It's not the whole thing. And so that's how the snake is able to repair itself. So what will happen is the snake will rub itself against a hard surface, and then it kind of peels itself back. It's like taking a sock off. It peels itself back and it moves out of the snake skin, and it has a fresh new layer to be able to go out and to live its life with a layer that's not damaged. All right, so that is scales that many reptiles have. The other option for body covering that a reptile can have is something called a scute. Now, a scute is very, very similar to scales, but they have some very little differences. And like we talked about, little differences in the science community make all the difference for classifying animals and finding the small little differences in those. So here I have, this is another snake skin. This isn't a shed. This is what the scales on the snake would look like. You see how they're overlapping to help with retain the moisture. And here we have some scutes. These scutes come from a crocodile. And so some of the species of animals that have scutes are things such as crocodiles and alligators and turtles, and they're much harder than the normal scales. In fact, the word scute comes from the Latin word scuta, which means shield or armor. So this acts as a really tough armor or shield for these reptiles that have scutes. And so you'll see one of the differences is the thickness. The scutes are much, much thicker than the scales were. These also come from the dermis, which is the lower layer of the skin, and they're formed out of a bony plate. So they're much, much harder. And we'll compare the two, and you'll see how the snakeskin had the overlapping, and the crocodile has no overlapping in the scales. They're all separated. And we talked about how the overlapping for the snakes was to be able to retain moisture, but the separation in the crocodile skin is so that it has a lot more mobility. It's able to move much faster because of that. So that is the scutes of the crocodile. All right, so we talked about the similarities between reptiles being their backbone and their scales or scutes. And there's another similarity that I'm going to talk about, and that is the way that their body temperature works. So you might have heard of animals being referred to as warm-blooded or cold-blooded before. And that's kind of the same idea as what this word that we're going to learn is, and it's ectotherm. So reptiles are ectotherms, and that means that they can't produce their own body heat. So they have to rely on their environment to maintain the temperature for them. Now the term cold-blooded isn't exactly correct because reptiles' blood is the temperature of their surroundings. So I have this little lizard here. You might have found a lizard out in the wild before. I've seen a lot of them down in southern Utah and that kind of area. And you might have found these lizards sunbathing on a rock or being in a really sunny, warm spot. And that's because they aren't able to maintain their body temperature. So if they want to be warm, they have to go sit out in the sun or they have to be in a warm environment. And so that's what the lizards do to maintain their body temperature. Us humans are called endotherms, and that means that we can maintain our own body temperature. So whether we're in the cold or we're in the hot, our body temperature remains around 97 to 99 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're able to maintain that on our own. But the lizards aren't able to do that. So to be able to maintain their body heat, they go in warm places, and if they get too hot, then they have to go sit in the shade for a while to cool down to maintain that body heat. So that word was ectotherm again. Ectotherm means unable to maintain your own body heat. And that's what all reptiles are, ectotherms. So they all have to maintain their body heat by their surroundings, by either sitting in the sun or sitting in the shade or going in the water to cool down. All right, so the three similarities between the reptiles that we talked about today are their backbone, their covering, which is either scales or scutes, and their ability to maintain their body temperature, which is through their environment, sitting in the sun or going in the shade. So reptiles have a lot of really cool similarities that put them in the same class of animals, but they're also still a very diverse group. And they have lots of different abilities that help to keep them alive in their various habitats and environments. So we're going to talk about just a couple really cool fun facts about reptiles and some of the differences. So the first one we're going to talk about is how fast reptiles are. We'll bring out our green iguana friend again. So green iguanas are very, very fast. Them and bearded dragons can run up to 25 miles an hour, which is about as fast as a car driving through a neighborhood. So if you were driving through a neighborhood at 25 miles an hour, this little guy could keep up with you. And they're very fast runners so that they can mostly outrun prey. In this guy's instance, green iguanas are mostly herbivorous, or they eat plants. So they use that to outrun their prey so that they don't get eaten. That's our green iguana friend here. All right, the next really cool adaptation that some reptiles have is the ability to lose their tail. So we'll bring out our small little lizard friend again, and I'll get him really close up to the camera. And if you'll see, there's kind of a line in his tail where it looks kind of a different color and the scales get a lot smaller. And that is where his tail fell off and he regrew a new one. So some species of lizard, when they are outrunning a predator or when they want to distract a predator, they can lose their tails. They can drop them off, or they can, if they get pulled off, they can let it go. And the tail will kind of wiggle around for a minute and distract their predator while they run away. That's because the nerve endings in the tail, after it falls off the lizard, well, the nerve endings will fire and it will cause it to kind of wiggle. And so that's how lizards are able to distract their predator so that they can run away. And then the cool thing, not only do they lose their tail, they're able to regrow their tails, which is so cool. They get tail cells and they grow right back, which is awesome. And so that is how they distract their predators, which is very smart and very cool. So snakes are awesome, awesome animals. They have really cool adaptations that, or not snakes, reptiles are really, really cool animals that have so many cool adaptations to help them survive in their environments. And we don't have time to go over all the differences and cool things about reptiles, but you can go ahead and learn that on your own and keep learning about the world around you and different kinds of reptiles and that sort of thing. So thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.